Hello, everyone. Hello, Dipanshi. Thank you to Kathia for the invitation. I'm very excited to be here with you today and to speak to colleagues from parts of the world that are not often taken into account in psychoanalysis. So I'm very pleased to be here with you today. I will be reading from a paper that engages actually also with some of Paul Preciado's work. And speaking a little about what's happening in psychoanalysis right now, politically, how we might rethink some of the issues around gender that have been very limiting for us. And I will have some clinical material that can be kept for the recording. So thank you for being with us today. Okay. A year ago, long before this invitation was extended to me, Nex Benedict was still alive. Some of you may have heard about Nex Benedict. Their name became very well known here in the United States. They were a 16-year-old non-binary adolescent who, it seems, was of Native American descent, who lived and died in Oklahoma. I'm starting my talk with Nex today because it is critical to appreciate that how we talk about trans children, which is the focus of my talk today, is not just a theoretical matter, even though I will very much argue that it is also that, but that it has material, sometimes life and death material consequences that extend outside the consulting room. And that puts our conversations around gender within psychoanalysis under kind of like a huge ethical magnifying lens. On February 7th, 2024, Nex was in the bathroom of their assigned gender, as was required by Oklahoma's restrictive bathroom law. And it's important to say here, to share a little bit of the cultural context about here in the United States, where there's a lot of legal fighting. It has become even more intense after the Trump administration came into office around questions of bathroom use and who belongs to what bathroom and so on and so forth. So Nex was as required in the restroom of their assigned gender when 3 female peers started harassing them. This was not a first for Nex. At this point, they had been bullied for over a year, but it would be the last time. Nex got angry and sprayed the girls with their water bottle. The girls physically attacked Nex, pulling their legs out from underneath them. Nex fell to the floor while the girls beat them until Nex lost consciousness, hitting their head on the floor multiple times. The assault was broken up by adults. When Nex came to, they felt dizzy and nauseous. An ambulance was not called for them. They were given pain medications and a 2-week suspension from their school. Their family did take Nex to the hospital to be checked out. But the following day, Nex collapsed in their family home. By the time the EMTs, the emergency services, arrived, Nex was already dead. Following an autopsy, the Owasso Police Department declared that Nex's death did not result from the assault. But a video from the body camera of a police officer who interviewed Nex at the hospital surfaced a few days later and shows that Nex had reported that they blacked out from the beating. And that was something that had been retracted. And then after that, the police department retracted their statement about the non-relation between their death and the assault. The officer is heard on the video discouraging Nex's guardian, their grandmother, from filing a police report. Since it was Nex who threw the water first, he said, Nex might be in fact legally liable. And it was in this protective context that Nex's family was advised to not file a police report, to protect Nex ostensibly. Of course, by now, as this conversation is being had, we know that Nex ended up dying. So to deter the family from filing a police report by threatening that it would be Nex, in fact, who might be liable, when Nex will shortly thereafter die from the assault, is how many trans individuals and their families, especially those that are not afforded the protections of whiteness, are routinely treated by the law as having instigated their own death. Hence the twisted turn of logic, where Nex would be at risk for being held responsible for having created the circumstances that caused their own dying. This is the cruel cultural backdrop against which we're having today's conversation, where it is possible for a child's family to be told that their child could be blamed for having been killed by anti-trans hatred. Commenting on Nex's death, Oklahoma State Superintendent for Public Schools, Ryan Walters, said that while the death was tragic, it was not grounds for revisiting the handling of gender issues in school. The state senator, Tom Wood, similarly said that, quote, his heart goes out to Nex's family, unquote, but he added later, quote, we are a Republican state. This is the conservative party in the United States that current President Trump is actually serving under. Back to the quote, we're a Republican state, a supermajority in the House and the Senate, and I represent a constituency that doesn't want that filth in Oklahoma, unquote. The filth in question was Nex. And the problem, of course, is not only Oklahoma bound. In the United States, the House Freedom Caucus has been threatening to shut down the government over policy riders that include anti-trans national bans, with gender-affirming care and sport bans being a high priority. Now, this was kind of like these events with Nex were happening before this current administration came into office. At the time, many Republican candidates were running on agendas that foregrounded their anti-trans intentions, many of them homicidal in consequence. Because how should we interpret the notion that while it's sad that Nex died, reform is not on the table, other than as a willingness, if not a wish, to sacrifice genderqueer kids? And as many of you might know, things have gotten much more intense since January, when the government has put in place formal provisions that are being obeyed, even though they're not yet law, by current institutions that limit the definition of who is male and who is female, really kind of like speak quite aggressively and problematically and unethically, in my opinion, around genderqueer kids. So this is the political background. And though I start with the United States, which is where I live and I'm more familiar with things, it is also the case that many other parts of the world, of the Western world, like I'm thinking very much about the UK, that recently there was a formal legal definition of woman as a stand woman at birth. There are ongoing feverishly escalating anxieties around gender that have always been there, but are now being turned into policy and legislative. Take a policy and legislative form. Now, of course, you might wonder, like, what does this have to do with psychoanalysis? But of course, psychoanalysis is not existing outside the social and outside these discourses. So it's really important to be able to think about them together. But I will also shortly say a little bit more about these connections. I start with Nex, not only to alert us and remind us that many states in the United States, many governments, and many parts of the world, there's a formal declaration of open season on genderqueer kids, to paraphrase Eve Sedgwick on queer kids, and that we're discussing today a very vulnerable population, or even to underscore how harmful transphobia is, which it is, or to urge us to be more open, which we should be. I start there because of how significant it is to understand the very important role that psychoanalysts are playing in this process in the public domain. Psychoanalysts who vociferously contest trans childhoods by lacing psychoanalytic theorizing with what seems like bigotry to me. These psychoanalysts are not only doing dyadic work in their private offices, some are involved in work that is used to effectively curtail the rights of trans people, to restrict healthcare access, and which directly contributes to the climate of suspicion and hostility against trans and non-binary patients. To put this more clearly, these psychoanalyst claims are not driven by what I would see as solid psychoanalytic thinking. That, in fact, would be welcome and even a respite. What we get instead is a substitution of analytic considerations by question of internet habits or brain maturation, which frequently ventriloquize parental anxieties rather than helping parents contain them. And I've written a review about my concerns about how uh, the Evans's book on gender dysphoria coming out of their work at the Tavistock Clinic has a lot of these features, which I'm happy to share if anybody's interested. My goal today is to show you why an interest in the care, but also in the growth and the flourishing of trans children and in the development of psychoanalytic theory that thinks about gender differently is not an antagonism, but a convergence. I would argue that rather than debate these colleagues, that we do something different, that instead of getting engaged in fighting them and disagreeing with them when we know that that they are not interested in genuine dialogue, that we reroute the resource of our attention. Not only are they not interested in genuine dialogue, but like their project seems to be different than the project that I have in mind for genderqueer patients, which is the flourishing of genderqueer patients. That instead of getting into elaborate back and forths, that we reroute the resource of our attention to advancing psychoanalytic theory so that we can work differently with trans and queer patients. I say this because one of the reasons, in my opinion, that trans childhood especially has become such a difficult issue in psychoanalysis is that trans childhoods have confronted us with the limits of our metapsychology. And I want to say one quick thing about trans childhoods, like, Dipanshi started very smartly with talking about Paul Preciado being basically booed off the stage when he was speaking to psychoanalysts. And I think that we can draw a line between the invalidation of trans childhood and how even adults are now more explicitly being targeted for the withdrawal of medical care or transphobia. So I think it's very important to understand, and many trans theorists and critical trans critical contributors to trans studies have noted that this is not just about children, that children and weaponization of the figure of the child, a child that is usually, and here I'm thinking of the capital C child, that what Lee Edelman calls the figural child, the figure of the child, a child that is usually imagined as heterosexual, white, able-bodied, middle class, that figure of the child has become a big wedge, through which its innocence is being galvanized, its protection is being prioritized, and through this approach to thinking about children, the consent of children, that is really about how the child stands in for state projects, for reproductive futurity. Through the figure of the child, all kinds of rhetorics and policies get smuggled in that then will eventually affect adults. So this is not just about trans childhoods or developmental concerns. It's mostly, I would argue, about transness itself, but childhood is an easier place through which somebody can get in and begin to make anti-trans arguments that will eventually erode thinking about transness overall. So I think that this question of adultness and childhood is something we should discuss more. Drawing from work that I've done in Gender Without Identity, a book that I have co-authored with Dr. Anne Pellegrini, I will specifically contest today the concept of core gender identity, a concept that was given to us by Stoller and which is nowadays very heartily embraced by analysts who want to be supportive of their trans patients. I will argue that we can do better than pitch our ethical standards on theorizing that I see as problematic, that implies that there's either a pre-programmed gender to which we belong and which is true or authentic, and I will offer one possible framework for the process by which we assume our gender and how the assumption acquires its intrapsychic grip. This framework puts pressure on the notion of a true gender, and actually not just gender, but on the truth of any other part of the ego. And I think this has also important implications for thinking about race. And we can talk about this more. And shows trauma to not definitionally arrest, but sometimes even galvanize psychic life. This is a challenging claim, which I will go into more. And last, I will argue for a critical and critically important distinction between thinking developmentally versus between what Anna Pellegrini and I have called developmentalism. The conceptual shifts I'm proposing are imaginative endeavors, which is not to say that they're not rigorously conceived, but they're endeavors to go beyond the realm of theories we have inherited and towards a more emancipatory psychoanalysis that treats different not as threat or with antagonism, but as an opportunity. So I will use the term anti-trans clinical activism today to capture work that I see as trans antagonistic done by clinicians who do not just treat patients and publish work on trans children that I see as damaging and problematic, but who become active outside the consulting room, participating in processes that by intent or implication actively restrict healthcare access for trans children and adults. And I think it's important to note that some of these analysts are not just acting in the consulting room, because those of us who are concerned like with social justice issues, with racial equality, with capitalism and how it affects our practices, with gender, with sexuality, are often accused of being activist. I'll say something more about this in a moment, when in fact, many of these clinicians who are concerned about what they see as kind of like a contagion of transness, like this problematic idea that somehow everybody now is becoming trans, and there's some panic around children who catch their gender on the internet or by interacting with having relationships with different other trans kids. It's very important to understand that these people accuse us who are interested in the flourishing of trans kids of being activists when they, in fact, themselves seem to produce work and actually even lend experts to legislative panels that make some of these decisions. So I'm thinking here of an organization that is in the US, active all over the world, and which is quite influential, called the Society for Evidence-Based Gender Medicine, SEGM for short, which has produced work that is cited to bolster the passing of anti-trans legislation. Given that our world is imperial, given that American imperialism kind of like trickles into and penetrates all kinds of other legislative, but also cultural moves around gender, and in psychoanalysis, given the fact that a lot of people, for reasons that are complex and problematic, look to literature generated in the US or in the UK. This is the IPA has many regions and many conversations, but the hegemony of white knowledge production is always there. And I think while we can be critical of that, we shouldn't act as if that's not the case. So given that what's happening in the United States is very important, not because it should lead the world, but because it does have such a powerful influence. That's why I'm talking also so much about the context here. And SEGM, this organization, which at this point has been designated as an anti-LGBT hate group by the Southern Poverty Law Center, which tracks extremist groups, and cut its teeth basically fighting the KKK. So this group has produced work that, as I was saying, is cited to bolster the passing of anti-trans legislation. And there are links between SEGM and members of SEGM, not all of whom are psychoanalysts, testifying to help strengthen the claim that there's cultural alarm vis-a-vis trans children, such that restrictions to healthcare access were necessary. Yale University's website had in the past described SEGM as a biased source of information and as an ideological organization which has misrepresented scientific data, quote, in violation of the scientific method and accepted conventions of research. SEGM's president, you will be interested to know, is a psychoanalyst. He's based in Australia, but he's trained in the US and is a training analyst in an American institute. Similarly, the concept of rapid onset gender dysphoria, which I referenced very quickly earlier, which falsely claims that trans kids kind of like are infected by their gender, they catch their gender on the internet, is officially credited to Lisa Littman, but has been shown by investigative work by Zenia Jones to have been partly engineered by the Jungian psychoanalyst Lisa Marciano. Psychoanalysts have also been at the leading edge of processes that ended up shutting down the Tavistock Clinic's gender service in the UK, which administered healthcare to trans youth through the anti-trans clinical activism of psychoanalysts David Hill and Marcus Evans. I offer these facts to illuminate the role that psychoanalysts have been playing in the public sphere, some of whom, as I mentioned earlier, in an ironic twist, can often be found protesting in print and in their lectures that those of us who are trans-affirming are doing activism instead of doing clinical work. And I'm doing this because I have a sense that many clinicians around the world are unaware of how active and impactful anti-trans clinical activism is in psychoanalysis. How harmful are these opinions of a handful of analysts, you might wonder? And my opinion is that it's very harmful, not only because there are the organizations that they work with, SEGAM and GenSpect, which has also been designated an anti-LGBT hate group, and GITA are well resourced, and it's not clear why. But as I mentioned, in fact, it's not clear why, but there's also some investigative journalism that links them to sources from the right. But as I mentioned, they also have had already a significant impact on policy and lawmaking. Without medicine and psychiatrists, so not only psychoanalysts, but also psychoanalysts, these bills, policies, and laws would not exist with the same kind of force, because it is from these fields that the root propositions powering these policies are lifted. In recent years, increased visibility and the noted benefits of gender-affirming care have drawn more transgender youth into the light. But this fact is now being used to generate public fear and scrutiny, which is a terrible bait and switch. The panic about trans children is being manufactured by creating confusion as to the data, as if the findings were contradictory and ongoing research is needed before anything proceeds. And for anybody who's not familiar with childhood psychiatry, a lot of medication here in the United States that is being prescribed to children is actually prescribed off-label, so that is not an unusual practice. Sitting with uncertainty has never been used more insincerely. Confusion here works to create doubt, and doubt in turn causes paralysis. What form does this paralysis take? I would argue that by taking the ethics of exploration and turning them in what appear to be conversion practices, organizations like GITA, the Gender Exploratory Therapy Association, among others, advocate for an approach that has come to be known as watchful waiting. Watchful waiting manifestly stands for taking one's time rather than rushing prematurely with a decision. I mean, what's wrong with that, right? I mean, we do that all the time in our clinical work. But insofar as it advocates for indefinite deferrals of transitioning until some undefined criterion has been met, watchful waiting is at heart a conceptual descendant of conversion. When done this way, gender exploration becomes a covert mitigation strategy against transitioning, dressing anti-trans sentiment, the idea that kids are only mistakenly thinking they're trans, as full clinical inquiry. Only those children who can endure years of psychiatric interference, of clinical pressure, and only those children whose families can carry the formidable costs that are associated with these processes may be eventually able to transition. You can imagine that a lot of these children this is also a racialized process, a lot of these children are white. So watchful waiting then favors trans children that are white, well-resourced, able-bodied, and not psychiatrically compromised, creating a very tight bottleneck through which only those trans subjects that are well-suited for white middle-class heterosexual outcomes can squeeze by. The debates these organizations and their influence produce operate on the principle of disorientation. They turn skepticism about trans life into a new form of certainty. The emphasis on scientific obscurity frames gender-affirming treatments as impulsive, as having uncertain effects, when they are in fact some of the most measured, thoughtful, and slow-paced decision processes in pediatric healthcare. Waiting lists for this time-sensitive care range from several months to years, and they are preceded by thorough multidisciplinary assessment processes. As for the claims of ROGD, rapid onset gender dysphoria, that trans identity spreads through social media, which is something that has not been replicated by research methods. Studies show by diligent research, and I say this because the original study was very much contested on methodological grounds. Studies show that over 90% of youth who receive gender-affirming care continue treatment in adulthood, while regret is vanishingly low. A 2022 study at 5 years follow-up found that only 2.5% of trans-identified people re-identified as cis, and a March 6 study in 2024 in JAMA, in the Journal of the American Medical Association, which is a very influential and well-respected journal here, found that only 4 of 995 patients re-identified as cis. So who is the target of this misinforming work? I would say it's analysts and clinicians, especially those new to this area, as well as parents, policymakers, and legislators. Parents too, of course, but sticking to analysts for now. These organizations attract their audiences with a lure of a crisis, and they become a rescue industry with outlandishly clumsy theorizing. For example, Marcus and Susan Evans recently compared parents who support their trans kids to Munchausen's by proxy, which is quite a bold and extraordinary claim that I've seen nowhere else in the literature, and for which there's no basis. Importantly, most individuals and organizations who do this destructive work tend to understand themselves as helping or saving somebody, children especially. But the question of whether somebody's motivations are benign or sinister, whether their motives are well-intended or hateful, is really besides the point, and this is one of my big arguments today. What matters is the impact of the work they're having. Think, for example, of Charles Socarides, who is one of the most notoriously damaging analysts in psychoanalytic history, who genuinely thought he was saving gay men from themselves and penned theory that oppressed gay people in and outside the consulting room, all in the name of protectionism. My guess is that he really did believe that he was helping these misguided men and that he perhaps meant no harm. But that is neither here nor there, because, earnest or not, he did very much hurt people, some of whom are still in our consulting rooms in their late 70s and 80s. This is why it's not wise to rely on the words of those representing or defending their organizations to determine their ethics. Personally, I look for other things that are independent of how somebody self-describes. I look to what effects the work has on the clinical and the social world, to how it is being used and to what ends. If it is used to fuel oppressive policies, I look to whether their work was misrepresented, and if so, whether their organization has protested such misuse. And I'm especially cautious with colleagues who do not use the word trans as a valid self-descriptor, but will only refer to gender dysphoria, which implies that one is dysphoric because they mistakenly believe they're trans. I mention this information not because I think that the fetishizing of data is the way to go, like when I was talking about studies. I really don't think that the truth is in numbers, but in people's lived realities and unconscious life, but because I want to underscore how anti-trans activism operates before I turn to the theorizing I will be proposing. One more thing to be aware of is that colleagues from GenSpect and Segam and Gita publish in professional journals and post interprofessional listservs, spreading the same misinformation and confusion. And the emphasis lately is on the future of the figure of the detransitioner, like the person. Detransitioning has become now a political category. It has become a category that ostensibly proves that somebody was wrong in having wanted to transition, and especially if they went, if they received care and then they detransitioned, it means it is then used as a way of proving that somebody did not receive good services, or that gender-affirming clinicians are too easily encouraging of transitioning, and therefore the detransitioner proves that gender-affirming care is problematic. It is time to stop debating and even dialoguing with analysts who hold such views. A critical disaffiliation from the concept of dialogue is important because it is urgent that we divest from conversations that are not meant to expand our analytic understanding of trans kids, but to constrict queer and trans life. We need to release ourselves from our fascination with debate, because in this context, it directs us towards an unwarranted skepticism that is draped in transphobic logics. And I say this not to be provocative. I know that saying like that we shouldn't dialogue with these colleagues is like really antithetical to most of the ways in which we talk about dialogue and conversation. But I think it's necessary because the whole point about academic freedom is exactly that, the freedom to exercise academic expertise in order to discriminate between good and bad concepts, between valid and invalid arguments. And this is not to cancel anyone. People can have whatever opinions they want, including bad or discriminatory ones. It is only to urge us to exercise professional judgment about the intellectual worth and seriousness of somebody's thinking. When it comes to transness, the jury is only out for those who want to remain willfully ignorant. Our efforts are better placed, in my opinion, not in dialoguing with those who see transness as cause for alarm, but in becoming better educated, in remaining attentive to our counter-transness, and, as is my focus today, in working to create thinking that meets the challenge of trans children by revisiting some of our foundational ideas. To propose that we disengage with these colleagues is not to be combative, but to the contrary, it's a very measured and proportional response to the stakes of this conversation. And I think that, if we are going to move past these conversations, what do we do if we don't pay attention to that? What do we pay attention to? Or rather, if we don't place our energies in that, of course, we should pay attention, as I've been saying throughout, to what is happening and how they're affecting things, which is not the same thing as engaging with them. So what do we pay attention to? I think that special attention is due to our metapsychological foundations that allege that development is linear and staged, that psychic life answers to overdetermined motivations in psychic history without taking contingency and invention into account, because of the difficulty we have in considering the workings of the après-coup in child treatments. Anyone familiar with Laplanche's efforts to renew psychoanalytic foundations will recognize in my project his intent to buttress our foundations and fortify psychoanalysis, though I'm going to go about this a little bit differently, prioritizing queer and trans life. So the premise of my talk today is that working towards the growth and the support of trans children, that having an affirmative desire that trans children exist and that they're not just accepted or tolerated, but wanted in the world is very important. Those of us who work with children generally know how critical it is for a child to be wanted and how vital for them to feel that their existence brings pleasure to their adults. And there are many reasons to be proud to have a trans child, not least of which because it means that one child is sturdy enough to tell their family and the world, no, I'm not what you think I am. This, my clinical experience shows me, is a process that requires no small amount of courage in the child and true trust and hope in the relationship with the adult. But what does this have to do with a new metapsychology? First of all, psychoanalysis, I would argue, does not understand childhood. It has a set of ideas about it. In other words, I think that it's really interesting that we don't talk about critical childhood studies. For those of us who work with children, critical childhood studies gives us the insight that there are many theories of childhood, and that these theories of childhood are not just different ways of how development works, but they also have different effects in the world. And I would really encourage those of you interested in this domain to read Lee Ullman's work and Jules Gill-Peterson's work on trans children, and Camille Owens's work on Black children and how race, questions of intelligence, questions of psychic maturity, and of queerness play into the figure of the child. So psychoanalysis has its own theory of childhood. And I say that it has a theory of childhood, not only to say that these ideas are not definitively right, it's also to say that it has theories of childhood that cannot account for the existence of trans children. And rather than redefine our theory, it has responded to the existence of trans children with a sense of anxiety. Our current theories are not tailored for trans existence, and they're knit through gender normativity and binary gender. Think, for example, about the Oedipus complex. It starts with the presumption of binary gender and, of course, heterosexuality, and it produces binary gender. I can say this more if you want to, which means that the only way to incorporate gender diverse experience is through being inclusive. And I will shortly explain why, though necessary to be exclusive, this is a starkly insufficient condition. But these new foundations have to be responsive to the social and to the political. And this is not about ceding psychoanalysis to political correctness, as some people worry, and as I will soon show. It is to say that we're working towards an emancipatory psychoanalysis, that inside that the insights and knowledge that we have acquired through discourses of race, of child studies, of religion, disability, have to be knitted into these new foundations. So, as I said, psychoanalysis has a theory of childhood, which means that psychoanalysis is not in possession of some truth. So, by the way, do many other disciplines like queer studies, race studies, childhood studies. The concept of childhood does not just pertain to actual children, children's futurity, questions about their reproduction, the notion of a child's innocence. All of these make the category of the child with a capital C. The idea of protecting children is especially tricky because it does not just index a particular child's need for protection or the fact that children need protection. It calls upon children's exquisite vulnerability and can become an alibi for laundering all kinds of violences through the figure of the child. Think, for example, of how Black and Indigenous children were and are still stolen from their parents through forced adoptions, through incarceration and foster care, and all of that is done in the name of protecting them. It is the figure of the capital C child here that licenses this kinds of mistreatment of actual real-life children. Those of us who work with kids need to care not just about the children we treat, but also to be very aware and mindful of and critically engage with the various discourses that circulate about the capital C child in the social world. Because it's only by being aware of them that we'll then be able to sense how they seep into the consulting room. Said differently, we should not accept a consideration of trans childhood under the rubric of inclusivity or as part of a diversity or effort or psychoanalysis DEI initiative. DEI is the shorthand we use in the United States for diversity, equity, and inclusion. This may sound strange to hear me say, but widening the perimeter of inclusion, I think, is not a solution to the problem. It's a way of avoiding the problem, because rather than eliminating some of the conditions that create the problem of who gets in and who gets out, who gets included and excluded, inclusivity feeds and sustains the system that sustained the problem in the first place. To abolish metapsychologies that produce the conditions that make transphobia possible is more challenging, but it is also perhaps most fruitful. To put it differently, if some of our foundational ideas so deform the ethical stakes of our field, we need to reject and rework them. Better than step out of substantively corrective action, better than later letters of apologies, of acknowledgments of harm, at attempts of reparation. For me, such a call is to work towards eviscerating the conditions that can produce abuse in psychoanalysis, and we have to admit the fact and work against the fact that psychoanalysis has been abusive and continues to be abusive. So calling for a retwisting of our metapsychology is not to be adversarial, it's to discern an opportunity. What is this opportunity? To harness ourselves to the dedication for a better and deeper psychoanalysis, a form of ambition for psychoanalysis that does not harm minorities and which is willing to allow itself to be undone and redone, to be unscrewed and rescrewed. Okay. To make my way towards these new foundations that I've been promising, I will first summarize the parts of Laplanchian theory I've been relying on. For Jean Laplanche, the encounter between the adult and the child introduces a disturbance. Every conscious communication, as well as every not consciously intended nonverbal communication, is compromised by an enigma, the unbound energy that proceeds unidirectionally from the adult to the child and which issues from the adult's sexual unconscious. To cope with the strain of this errancy, which he called implantation, the infant gives form to enigma by means of codes that she sources from the adult world, and how the adults scramble these codes through their own unconscious as they communicate them to the child. And that adult world is a mythosymbolic world of meanings. The child combines these meanings idiosyncratically, crafting her own meanings that draw from the larger life worlds of myths and symbols to which she is exposed through her parent, but which are also deeply personal creations, the outcome of a strange kind of autonomy that Pellegrini and I describe in our book as, quote, the queer agency of the unconscious, unquote. Importantly, the relationship between enigma and translation is inherently capricious, chained together not by accuracy or truth. In other words, we don't figure out what the enigmatic was, but by the child's idiomatic effort to convert the disquiet of the enigmatic into a more pacified, docile form. Jean Laplanche calls this translation, but Dominique Scarfoni has recently intervened to clarify that the transformation of unbound energy to a bound arrangement is nothing less than an energetic conversion, which he described as transduction. What Scarfoni meaningfully added is that the job of the ego is to experience transduction, which is the necessary conversion of one form of psychic energy, unbound energy, to something more stable. To experience transduction as translation, that is, in the après-coup, to render the energetic transformation of unbound energy to bound energy as if it were but a mere translation of what was always already there, as if it were but a mere decoding of what was communicated by the other. So transduction is the process by which something gets converted. Translation is the process by which what has gotten converted is rendered not as a creative effort of the child, but as a mere reading of a subtext to the text of what the parent sent it. The ego, in other words, believes itself to be the author of its own intentions. This is where narcissism comes in, primary narcissism, as if it has fully constructed itself. This is the liberal form of what we usually encounter under the rubric of agency, which is often understood as a deliberate exercise of one's will and volition. But from a metapsychological, psychoanalytic perspective, this is a misunderstanding. Agency is not what we decide to do when we free ourselves from our constraints. It is what happens amidst the constrained possibilities, where we make a life out of materials we did not choose, from within conditions and intergenerational inheritances we did not opt for, histories we were born into and did not select, and by means of codes that are not of our own making. So this is a very strange definition of kind of like thinking about what agency means, to kind of like connect it to constraint. But agency is not this unconstrained, fantastically unconstrained exercise of one's will. Of course, we all have a craving for a center, a longing for that mythical origin point, or for a total comprehension of our starting points. But from a metapsychological point of view, the ego's job is to close that loop and to create the illusion of a centered, self-produced self that was not affected by anything it did not choose. As for the sexual unconscious, Jean Laplanche described the impossibility of psychic organization as a failure of translation. But here I would like to differ from Laplanche by pointing out that this formulation is only defensible from the perspective of the ego. It is only from the ego's perspective that the certainty that enigma is never fully translated and that a remainder always remains, that this process might be seen as failing. So what if the remainder is not a failure, but that which escaped? What if we thought at this moment with Fred Moten's notion of fugitivity? Fugitivity for Fred Moten, and of course he's working with, he's working in the shadow of thinking about histories of enslavement and of settler colonialism, and especially of Blackness. So fugitivity for Moten is, quote, a desire for and a spirit of escape and transgression of the proper and the proposed. And it is a desire for the outside, for a playing or being outside an outlaw edge proper to the now always already improper voice or instrument, unquote. Within this framework, then, we might conceive of that which cannot be psychically ordered, meaning the sexual unconscious, not as indexing a failure of the ego to translate it and an incapacity, but as that which has escaped capture by the symbolic and by representation. The ego would always prefer to fully deplete the perturbations issuing from the unconscious. So it is precisely because of that fugitive strain in our psyche that we ever manage to evade the totalizing grasp of psychic organization. Still, what gives translation its intrapsychic grip is precisely the fact that it proceeds from the psychic process of the subject. It is this that makes one's translation feel one's own, even as they are stitched from materials that are not of one's own creation. And this is also why each translation is both very personal but also entirely provisional. The fugitivity of the unconscious, its anarchic and untamable force, does not only pose problems, it also guarantees that it will always be possible, should the conditions arise, for a translation to be undone later, to be detranslated and retranslated again differently in the après-coup. What this means as far as gender is concerned is that contrary to the way we usually think about gender, meaning as a central component of our ego and an expression of our deep subjectivity, gender experience, all gender experience, not just trans, but also cis, arises as a result of translating the enigmatic dimensions of how gender is assigned to us via gender codes of femininity and masculinity. So rather than an interior psychology, the acquisition of gender arises through psychic processes that are put in motion with a caretaking adult sexual unconscious, which is another way of saying that gender starts allocentrically. Our gender starts from the outside. Gender, in other words, is neither true nor false. It's neither correctly perceived or a confused falsity. It is merely the result of translational processes. This means that neither cisgenders nor trans or genderqueer genders are genuine or ingenuine. And if this feels like a strange thing to say, especially at a time that we have so doubled down on transness, narrating transness or genderqueerness as a genuine feeling of authenticity, if my argument feels like a strange thing to say, it's partly because of how decisive of an impact Robert Stoller's work has had in psychoanalytic theory when he proposed the notion of the concept of co-gender identity and said that it is partly biologically driven. This then is my first proposition in renewing our foundations, to jettison the concept of a co-gender identity, and its implications will soon cascade into the second. But I should quickly add here that the fact that gender identity is not stable or immutable need not worry us, nor is this something about which psychoanalysis needs to be defensive, even as the current cultural climate makes immutability and truth a condition for transitioning. This framework de-ontologizes transness and is in keeping with recent moves made by trans theorists Grace Lavery and Kaji Amin, and it also disontologizes cisness, because this experience also would be the result of translating gender assignment through gender codes. And this undoes a little bit like the difference and the different valence that we ascribe to this experience as opposed to trans experience. Under this model, both would come out of translating processes, and both are equally untrue and true at the same time. What this means as far as children are concerned is that there does not now, nor has there ever existed, a way to diagnose somebody as truly trans, just as there's no way to diagnose somebody as truly cis, whatever that means. This, of course, also immediately puts pressure on the way in which the figure of the trans child has been consolidated, which is under the very, and this is the progressive view, right? The very restrictive rubric of core gender, which to be valid also needs to have expressed itself from early on and to have been consistent and unambivalent. To see gender identity as a futile attempt that we now need to retire is not bad news. It's actually a stroke of luck for clinical thinking, because it means that we can be released from the tyranny of thinking gender health as stability and gender coherence as a marker of psychic integration. Nor could either of these two, stability and coherence, be then justified to hold against trans kids who are asking for hormonal interventions. If we were to accept that gender is not a truth at the core of the self, but the invention that arrives through translation, this also disorganizes the arc of how we think about developmental theory, which usually describes the process by which one moves, if all goes well, from point A to point B to point C. And it also inevitably disorganizes the therapeutic technologies we have imagined might secure, course correct, or enable children to negotiate that arc. What is forged out of this complex tangle of enigmas and plantations, and of the codes scrambled by the adult's unconscious, which the child has then to inevitably rely on to convert the formlessness of enigma into a form, is the outcome of this process that translation belongs to the patient's psychic repertory. And I would argue it is the analyst's job to help the patient test it and defend it. Put differently, to say that translation is not true is not to say that it is false. It is to say that the analyst's job is to help the patient see if they can make the fiction that is gender, cisgender, non-binary gender, transgender, if they can make the fiction that is gender work as truth, if the patient can live in a way that induces the effects of truth in the aftermath of gender's formation. So you see, like I'm also arguing for a way of thinking about gender that is also very temporally, is very provisional, but also very temporally sensitive. Only in the future will one know if the experiment of their gender came to work as truth, which is another way of saying that what makes one's gender real is not its truthfulness or its ontological standing, but whether one can make the fiction that is gender to work as psychic reality. Psychoanalytic truth, Barnaby Barat writes, quote, diverges from conventional notions of correspondent, coherent, consistent, constructed, consensual, or pragmatic truth, unquote. What this requires of us, of course, is to let go of the illusion of security that truth or authenticity promise to us. And many of us who work in gender-affirming ways have, I think, to our kind of for understandable reasons, but I don't think it's a good idea, have clung to truth or authenticity. We need to recognize that at stake is not validity, but that innovation, invention, and inspiration are really the psychic processes that give us to ourselves. And from this perspective, as I've been saying, cisness too would be contingent, not a natural or normal state, but one that one may get to experience as natural or originary, though of course the contingencies synergizing to produce cisness, are far more extensive, and they're more baked into the fabric of our social world, and thus also of our primary objects. And this is my second proposed foundational revision, a move to take experimentation and invention seriously when it comes to the constitution of psychic life. Part of this requires of those of us who are analytic clinicians to challenge the prohibition against invention when it comes to how the psyche works, and to recognize that provisionality is built into the fabric of all psychic operations. And that tips the clinician's mind towards a form of thinking that does not rhyme with certainty, but which is conjugated in the grammar of experimentation. To say this is, and I have no doubt about this, and this is what makes this proposition anxiety-provoking, is to take away the guardrails promised to us by notions of truth or authenticity. But I would say that these guardrails are illusory. And it is also to think with contingency, because the codes, meaning the words, the systems of meanings, and the ways in which these meanings coagulate into affects that the child's psyche uses to give form to the formlessness of enigma are perpetually subject to retroactive revision and reinscription. To think with translation, detranslation, and retranslation is to be anti-essentialist, to believe that there is no essential gender in us, not through biology, not through God, not a psychological interiority. What would it mean to think of gender as experimental, as open to being retranslated, which is another way of saying that gender might shift once or more than once in one's lifetime? And this gives us another way to think about the weaponized category of detransitioning, which in this framework is better understood not as a return to one's previous gender category, but as a new transitioning, as a retransitioning. How, however, do such retranslations happen? And what are the conditions that create the circumstances for something to become detranslated so that it may be available again for retranslation in the après-coup? For that mechanism to be put in motion, a second coup, a second blow is needed. And I'm thinking here with the theory of the après-coup as elaborated by Jean Laplanche, which I can say more about in the Q&A, what Laplanche called not a full-blown trauma, but a traumatism. Traumatisms stand to provide the excitatory potential that may act to dissolve existing translations. This then is my third revisional proposition, that we as clinicians build a tolerance for thinking about how trauma does not just disrupt us, but may also become a source for transformation. And this is related to the concept of traumatophilia that I have elaborated elsewhere. Not only something that arrests and holds us, but something that may, because of its energy and force, liquidate the links forged by the ego, produce generative crises that dissolve the ego, giving way to new translations. Pushing back against the tendency to reflexively assume that if trauma has a share in the development of atypical genders, that necessarily delegitimizes them, I'm actually arguing for a way of thinking about trauma as having a share in the constitution of trans life, just as it has a share in the constitution of cis life, and to do so not to question the validity of trans or genderqueer genders, but to articulate their textures. It may be evident by now. I'm going to bring this to a close, and actually I'm going to leave out the clinical material so we have more time to talk. It may be evident by now that this way of thinking puts tremendous pressure on linear time and also to linear and teleological models of development. What I have been fleshing out is a dynamic way of thinking about development that does not collapse into developmentalism. The notion of developmentalism implies a succession of steps or stages, as if development were an unfolding, and this is a quote from Laplanche, of potentialities that are already present that simply reveal themselves in a predetermined order, unquote. Attending to development dynamically does not involve does not involve tracking an expected progressively maturational sequence or guarding for the conditions that will enable this, but it rather pays close attention to how these sequences are undergirded by the sexual unconscious. The querying of development then is not about noting where things went off course so that analysts may intervene and course correct, nor does it mean identifying where psychic life got bent out of shape so that it may be straightened out. Rather, it's about fostering space for thinking about the evolving dynamic dimensions of how patients, adults, and children especially, experiment with themselves in the domain of gender and beyond to arrive to their own idiosyncratic gender translations. Even genders that don't line up with our existing gender expansive dictionaries. Such thinking offers entry points for the analyst who has done the serious personal work of thinking about gender and their own in particular, to engage their typically gendered patients in more nuanced ways. In calling for this revisitation of our foundations, I'm calling on us to imagine psychoanalytic foundations that address also our trainees' disillusionments with psychoanalytic training and psychoanalytic institutions. I'm calling for a psychoanalysis that is stripped of euphemism or equivocation when it comes to the ethics of difference. To use psychoanalysis to resist trans oppression will require us to think again and to think better, and to choose who we are in conversation with. What better recipe than this for falling in love with psychoanalysis all over again? And if this pulls the epistemic rug from under our feet, well, this may be necessary. Psychoanalysis is not at risk if we allow ourselves to keep developing our thinking, if we respond to the encounter with phenomena that we cannot account for, not by recoiling or doubling down, by daring to go further. I have been implicitly arguing then for a clinical stance that rather than trying to ascertain if the patient's trans identity is true or not, takes the analyst's job as involving the taking of sides, not with any one identity per se, but with the patient's invention and experimentation. This is an exacting treatment philosophy, and I say philosophy because there is no technique to be extracted from my paper today. Working in this way requires taking a leap with a patient and daring to think things anew. It pries us away from the universal, which is what's posited by developmentalist thinking, and which leaves out considerations of race, ability, religion, and other difference. And it pulls us towards the singularity of each child before us. And from that angle, then, what I'm proposing today is both very big, but also very modest, which is to take children as individuals rather than as organisms that need to be able to produce certain forms of gender for our satisfaction or relief. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Avgi, for such insightful lecture. And I think the floor is now open for Q&A. And anyone who has any questions, yeah, please raise your hand or use the chat. Please go ahead. Shreya, was it Shreya?
Hi, hello there. I'm forming a question, but I'm also really sitting with so many thoughts that you brought up, and I'm just really interested in understanding a little bit more about what you mentioned about enigma.
And I'm happy also, I should say this explicitly, this paper was very packed, and especially for those of you that are not very familiar with Laplanche, it may feel a little bit enigmatic or convoluted, so I'm happy to go over concepts. So enigma for Jean Laplanche has to do with the fact that every communication between an adult and a child involves a number of different layers. The one is what is actually said, what is actually done, right? Another layer is what we are not aware of in our communications with children, like the adult's envy, the adult's competitiveness, the adult's identification with the child and the vulnerability that entails. All of these are unknown to us, but nevertheless inflect our communication with children. So they may be sensed in some way such that in kind of like multiple years later in another treatment, you might be able to retrieve this sense of, oh, this actually, I always sensed this from my mother, or now I begin to understand that my mother had this kind of feeling or another kind of feeling. But in addition to all of this, or rather aside from all of this, Laplanche adds another element, which is to say that even beyond the things that are known to us and the things that are not yet known to us but are there, there's always a dimension in our communication that has to do with the adult sexual unconscious, which are things that the adult can never be aware of themselves, are unformed and enigmatic to them. And what this introduces in the encounter with a child is not a message in the sense of a signifier. It is a disturbance. It is unbound energy. And then that unbound energy, the child will have to somehow grapple with. He calls it somewhere as a disturbance, as a foreign body, and as a thorn on the side of the ego. And this, I think his theory is very helpful to think about foreignness and otherness, precisely because it starts with the premise that the occasion for our becoming is precisely the otherness that comes to us from the other, who is other not just in the sense of being separate, but who is an alien to us and installs in us inadvertently things that they are not aware of, that we are then stuck with and have to live with. And this is the constraint that I was speaking about. But it is also in response to trying to translate, to make sense of what happened, that the infant that puts in motion this, and this is what is agentic about our life, the effort to make sense of it. Right? So this is what enigma means for Laplanche. Does that, it's very quick and it's a bit oversimplified, but does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm beginning to kind of see it to some extent. I would love to read a little bit more. Could you spell this person out to me? I would love to research
Yeah,
or figure
absolutely. Let me see how I should do this. Sorry. I don't usually work with Google Meet. Oh, here it is. Okay.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And I must say that what you said about agency, that really deeply touched me. Thank you so much.
I'm very glad. If we have time, if nobody else wants to jump in with another question, I would love to know what feels touching about it, because I think it's part of working with the theory. But let's see if there are other questions.
Sure.
Hiba, if I'm pronouncing your name correct. Yeah.
Thank you, Hiba. Hi. Thank you. Took lots of notes. I'll have to rethink a few things. At the end, you had said that you wouldn't necessarily, give a technique or strategy, which of course is fair. But you did propose one, which is a critical disaffiliation with dialogue. And this is something I have really been engaged in thinking about in relation to what are the possibilities of a given dialogue with a particular interlocutor, or not at all. Am I entering into the dialogue either perceiving them or them perceiving me as, don't want to use the word equal, but as an other, as a relational ethical other, or not even? That precondition doesn't exist, then why am I even in this conversation? So because it's something that I've been really thinking about in relation to multiple intersections for the people, for myself and people I work with, I would love to hear a little bit more about that in any direction that you'd like. Because we talk, enter into a conversation as if everyone is included or invited or hosted and who's doing the hosting and who gets invited. There's just so many layers to it. So I
Yes.
would love to hear a bit more, just to hear a bit more. Thank you.
Yes. I took some notes as you were speaking. Like I do that when people ask questions. So if you see me looking down, that's what I'm doing. Okay, I can't imagine a more important question right now in psychoanalysis. So I will start thinking intersectionally. I will start, like, for me, the most glaring example of that right now has to do with Palestine. And it has to do with what's happening with the genocide in Gaza and the ways in which dialogue has been weaponized. And psychoanalysis gives us the tools to actually pervert in a bad way, to disfigure what dialogue can mean. So you said, like, you shared some thoughts about, like, are you engaged as a relational other? Are you included? Are you invited? Who's doing the hosting? But I would say that inclusion, part of my point about inclusion being like an insufficient metric, is that inclusion means that I have a home and I will expand the perimeter so that you can also be included, but it's still my home, which goes to the question of hosting that you were speaking about, like who sets the term of inclusion, and inclusion is an important element of this. But I think that this is where psychoanalysis also needs to think with power, because inclusion and exclusion are exercises of power, when in fact what we would wish is for those who have power to rethink not just their power, but also the very foundations that constitute their power. That's why I'm arguing for psychoanalysis rethinking its foundations. Like, I am less interested in, for example, the gesture being extended to a Palestinian to be included in conversations about a ceasefire, than a reconsideration of the Nakba. So kind of like that's what I mean by foundations, that they have to take the historical into account. They have to take into account how the edifice of thinking has been put together to serve certain goals. And in psychoanalysis, the edifice of thinking, whether it was intentional or not, whether it was an effect of power or an intent of power, has been constellated around heterosexuality, whiteness, cisness, and so on and so forth. Now, many people will say, oh, but this is too much sociology, too much social justice. It is precisely not that, not because I am timid about saying that I care about social justice, but I do, and I think we should all care about justice. We're citizens of the world. We're not just existing in our consulting rooms. I think it's really important because we are sitting on rotten foundations. And rather than constantly be trying to enforce them so that kind of like, this is what Laplanche called, he talks about this very explicitly, just so that we keep the edifice up, we have to have the courage to rethink them. So towards that rethinking, some of the work that I've been doing more recently, and it wasn't in my talk today, is to rethink the concept of dialogue, to rethink the way dialogue has been given to us, especially through the Kleinian model and the concept of maturity, being able to empathize with the other, which is the epitome of psychic maturity, is the epitome of thinking about the depressive position as opposed to splitting, and the paranoid schizoid position. It has been given to us as the apex of relational capacity. And then we have somehow, and that's a developmental model, part of the developmental model that I was criticizing earlier. But what this does not take into account is how, and I can say much more about this, but I'll see if there's interest in the room about that. The Kleinian model of reparation has always been about repairing the aggressor, never about repairing the harm done to the person harmed. And I think that that's a very, very critical thing to understand, like the scholarship of David Eng, the work that Joshua Chambers-Letson, Caroline Laubender, and definitely the work that Lara and Stephen Sheehy have done on the concept of repair, leads us, I think, I recently just completed an article which will be coming out next year, talking about the importance of taking an anti-reparative turn in our field, to push back against all of these fantasies that there is a way to repair, not by attending to the person who is harmed, but to the self-esteem of the person doing the harming. And I think that is critical to thinking about dialogue. I was at a conference. I'll say one more thing and then I'll stop. But I was at a conference yesterday put up by the White Institute on irreverence, and somebody gave a paper talking about how genocide is a word that is too activating for some people, and that if we really want to be in conversation about what's happening in Gaza, why do we have to use the word genocide? Why can't we just agree that what's happening is mass massacres and that that's a problem? And this idea that people that is being genocided, or those of us who care about the genocide, should not use the word genocide because it might be a painful reminder or have painful associations for some people, is really not about attending to who is being harmed right now, but about attending to the feelings of a people who have been genocided themselves, who have now become genocidaires. So there's something about reparation and dialogue. Dialogue has always the quality of reparation, of preserving links, come what may, which developmentally is important for the child. But we're not all links need to be preserved, and that's part of what my argument that we can be released from the obligation to dialogue with everyone. We can be more discerning about who we're in conversation with. I'm sorry, Heba, this was like a very, very long answer.
No, it's perfect. I literally just read the chapter on critiquing dialogue by the Shihis like a few days ago, and it's been on my mind also in terms of our internal dialogue. Like, who are we in politics of recognition? Like, even internally in my inscape, who am I in dialogue with? Why do I need that?
Yeah.
Versus, and not just me, the people that I work with, like,
yeah,
that do I need recognition from a colonial or an oppressive or a normative or whatnot, versus what happens when I pay attention, I know it's real, it's there, but what happens when I turn my gaze somewhere else?
Yes. I think that that's really important, both in terms of thinking about internalized coloniality for those of us who are post-colonial. I'm part Cypriot myself, a formerly and presently colonized country. So the question of internalization is one aspect of this. Another aspect of this is the way in which those of us who are analytically trained, and I don't mean have gone to psychoanalytic institutes, who think with psychoanalytic ideas, like, there's also the moralizing of the depressive position, which has been drilled into us as the only way to stay in relation. And that, that idea that psychic maturity, that not splitting, it really works really well with internalized post-colonial experience. And it really works very well with internalized transphobia, and it really works very well with internalized heterosexism or patriarchy. So I'm thinking always about what's happening inside, what we have internalized, what we have inhaled from our cultural surround, and then how we're also given the tools by psychoanalysis not to deconstruct these only, but also to really settle into them. And this is the kind of psychoanalysis for which we want new foundations.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you.
Thank you for your question.
There is a question in the chat box. I'll just read out. Moon is asking, there is politics in the rhetoric. If we claim that there is no essentialness to gender in a clinical institutional context, would it not backfire? Most trans people would agree there isn't any inherent gender feeling in general. How do we deal with truth and the power that is associated with knowledge production and its implication, especially in terms of marginalized people?
Yeah, thank you, Moon. This is like the $1 million question. I think this is a really critical question. Of course, there's politics in the rhetoric. There's nothing without politics. So I'm not trying to offer an apolitical position. But I want to start with a question, would this not backfire? I would start with saying everything we've done has backfired anyway. So trans people have been saying, and those of us who are in support of trans life and who want to see trans people flourish have been saying for a while now, I mean, you know, like trans people are real, trans people exist. That has not taken us very far. The idea that there's some internal gender identity that can be that is true, and therefore that's why trans people should transition, has only led to people trying to then trans people in groups or in therapy so that their gender identity can be assessed. Right? So it has not taken us out of the problem. It has just created more technologies of gatekeeping and of surveillance that then ostensibly are set up to separate good trans subjects from bad trans subjects. And some trans subjects will clear that bar. And then they are offered as proof that this is how gender works. But that means that a lot of trans subjects, many of whom, as I was explaining in my talk, don't make it through the bottleneck of heterosexual adaptation, white adaptation, middle class, able-bodied, many of them get left out. So my interest is in how, with transness, but also with other forms of experience, how do we not participate in metapsychologies that create the architecture for the internal splits of groups, like the good Arab and the bad Arab, the good straight and the bad straight, the good trans person and the bad trans person, the healthy transness and unhealthy transness. So what I understand your question is also coming from, but truth is how you get things done. And that's what we've been told. But the truth is that even when you say, but that's my truth, you're still interrogated about, are you too traumatized to know? What about your unconscious? Do you really know your truth? So truth itself has not been an effective strategy. I also think that things don't work this way. I don't mean this just tactically. I also don't think that there's anything true or false about it. I think that everything is made up, which is not to say that everything is made up consciously or that it is under our conscious control to change it. This is what I mean by leaning into invention and leaning into experimentation. And the last thing that I'll say about your question is that what I'm saying is a form of knowledge production. That knowledge production is not just about the affirming of what is true and what is not true. Knowledge production is also to contest, and this, of course, I'm thinking with Michel Foucault here, is also to contest the regimes of truth that have been given to us as the metrics through which we can legitimize some experience and not other. And I think that that's a very psychoanalytic way of thinking, because if we think psychoanalytically, there's never one final truth that we can arrive at. Like our cisness and our transness and our gayness and our straightness, all of these are contestable in the psychic realm. I don't mean that analysts should then go in or should be given, nor do I mean this as permission, to the extent that permission is even relevant as a word, for analysts to go in and start like interrogating people about their conflicts, about their gender or this or that. I'm saying that in the sense that we're starting, if we think psychoanalytically, with the premise that there's no stable inside ground that we will find, that the unconscious always kind of like throws us off course. And that does not have to mean that we do not deserve the dignity of our identifications or our identity or our preferences. I know, Moon, that you can't, I think that you're the person who can't unmute or speak on the microphone. So I hope that yes, you are. I hope that this answers it. If it doesn't, please follow up.
So we have 3 questions. How do you prefer considering the time? Do you want all 3 questions at the same time, or do you want to go one by one?
I think we have some time still.
Okay. I think Rashmita, then Ayan, and then Emilio. Rashmita, we can't hear you if you are.
Oh, sorry. Hi, that was a really wonderful presentation. I was wondering if you could speak a bit more about race, especially because your concept of a gender without an identity and gender as invention. If we could think that in terms of race and how race can be an invention, and if there could be translation, if the translation theory could be applied to race, how one might theorize that. And I'm thinking about this especially because the border crossing of gender, the painful border crossing of gender has been theorized in queer studies, and but when it comes to race, and of course there is this like compulsion to border cross in terms of assimilation, where into the dominant group. But I'm thinking of it the other way around, because there have been some cases in the US where a person of the dominant group identifies as a Black person, for example, and then they live that fiction as their truth, and there's a lot of backlash against that. So if you had thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think whoops, I muted myself. I'm sorry. I think it's a really terrific question and a really challenging, bold question. So I really love it. And when I answer it with my thoughts, if you wanted to share your thoughts, it seems that you have some thoughts about this. I would love to hear them. This is what I would say. I think that the question of whether the category of race is fictional is absolutely true. It is absolutely a made-up category, and many people have written very intelligently. I'm thinking about Metavoy, for example, and his book, The Inner Life of Race, have written very compellingly about that and made that argument, tracking it through a transformation of religion, through a transformation of different kinds of categories. Racial capitalism gives us a way of thinking about the production of race as an effect of capitalist exploitation, and so on and so forth. So all of these discourses are out there, and anybody who's interested should go read them. And I do think that psychoanalysis needs to be engaged with discourses outside it. But I think that the question that you're posing in terms of translation and race is very important. I do think that racialization is also a translational process, and we touch a little bit on that in the book. The problem with saying that is that while with gender we have been comfortable, those of us who think in these ways, to deontologize it, the anxiety with race, with deontologizing race, is that it's a very ambivalent position, because on the one hand, we all recognize that all of these things are made up, and that in fact, the recourse to skin pigmentation or facial features or body, kind of like body presentation or like phenotype, to put it differently, that if we use that to determine race, that there's kind of like we're already in racist logics, right? But on the other hand, if we deontologize it, it means that race is not stable. And in fact, and in many ways, like there are people, I have a colleague, Marco Posadas, he's a psychoanalyst, he's Mexican and lives in Canada, and he talks about how he's racialized very differently in Canada as opposed to Mexico. In Canada, he's a person of color. In Mexico, he's not. Right? And he has to negotiate these different kinds of experiences of race and how he's being interpolated, and how that blends into his understanding of himself, and how he has to develop his own ways to relate to his race differently in this context. So that's one way to begin to think about how race is not a stable category. We can also think of people who are not just racialized into, think of people in both directions, racialized into whiteness, people who are white passing, and people who are not white passing, and how kind of like somebody may be like, I was giving a talk yesterday and somebody referred to me as a person of color. I mean, that was interesting. I don't identify as a person of color for a million different reasons, but it was an interesting moment. Like I found myself thinking, what does it do for that to be said, and for me to be called into that? One could easily, from a white anxiety perspective, say, no, just to be clear, I'm not identified as a white person, as a person of color. But what would that do? What would that mean? I think we have to be thoughtful about all of these things. The reason why I think that speaking about race as translation would make people anxious, even though I think that race is translation, is because we do not yet sufficiently understand that the mythosymbolic is part of how inventions are made to work as truths. And race is very much part of the mythosymbolic. And I think that that's really, really important. And as formulations of race are changing, racialization, I expect, will change. But Rashmita, this is a very quick and unorganized question about your answer to your question, which I think deserves a whole paper unto itself, which actually I've been thinking of writing for some time. Do you have anything you'd want to share with us about your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about this because I read this essay. Well, it's an article by Adolph Reed, and it's basically a criticism of Caitlyn Jenner and of trans people. And the argument that they use is that is how one might not accept a white person to identify as a black person and then live that way. And yeah, so they basically this progressive this like argument of saying that I think which basically are anti-trans arguments, which present themselves as a critique of the
Right.
liberal discourse.
Yeah.
It's so hard to challenge that, or like it's so hard to challenge that on their terms, and that's why I've been thinking
Yeah.
about it, but I don't really have a theorization on this.
No, it's very helpful to hear where you're coming from because, first of all, as far as Caitlyn Jenner is concerned, Caitlyn Jenner is moving from the socially dominant category to the less dominant category, right? So the parallel to somebody who is black identifying as white doesn't quite do it, right? So there's the question of like whether you're moving up or down the hierarchy, the privilege scale. But I think that for me, the answer to why can't we have, people have asked this question. There's a book, I'm going to remember who it's by, who has asked this question, why is transgender okay and transracialism not okay, right? So people have actually talked about this, and people have written on transracialism. The usual answer is, but racial identification also has to do with history, like with the history of a people, their oppression, their exclusions, their marginalizations, which is exactly what TERFs say about trans women. Right?
Yeah.
TERFs will say, but we as women have been oppressed in a way that trans women have not been oppressed. So they're kind of like, you begin to see that perhaps the answer out of that is not transracialism bad, transgender good, but that we have to rethink something about our foundations, about how we think these questions, to be able to think with that. Right? And that's why I'm proposing the thinking with invention and experimentation, not as a conscious process, but as a process that involves this clear agency of the unconscious, where you have to make do with materials that you didn't choose, that may be oppressive, but which nevertheless get woven into your translations. That I think that may be a more productive direction with which to think these kinds of questions, rather than are you this or are you that, or you're a man or are you a woman, where you transform. Do you remember playing with girls, with dolls when you were a girl? Because otherwise, if it happened after your parents' divorce or when you were 25 or 55, then it's not valid, right? I need to remember that book and I'll put it in the chat. Okay.
Ian, you can.
Yes. Hi. Thank you so much for your talk. So something that was said, you said along the lines of making the fiction work as truth, or this idea of to work to something becoming a psychic reality. This experimental idea is really, really interesting to me. And the thing that comes up with it is that in a way, it's like taking our fantasy and rather than withdrawing to our own fantasy, sharing it and putting it out into the world, which then there's the potential for it being transformed, but also rejected in a way. So in some ways, every time we experiment, we're looking for takers, or we're looking for others that will speak that language. And if, in particular, if we're creating a kind of new or unknown language, I mean, if it's totally unknown, there have to be some speakers, otherwise it's just, so I guess in some ways, it's like we are social beings ultimately, so we need to confront difference in our experiments.
Yes.
And I'm not sure what the question is here. Is I guess it seems like we're always bumping up against perhaps the other's willingness to give us permission or not.
You know,
or how much of that permission do we need, I guess I would say.
Yeah. And how much of that permission do we want, or will tie our identities to, is another question of that's aligned with what you're saying. What you're saying, Ian, reminds me also of Heba's point about recognition, because one way that we can take what you're saying is, okay, you can experiment, but eventually you need the world confirm you, to recognize you, and that's not true. Like, we need that recognition is also a kind of oxygen that we take from others, and having something work as truth can also happen through recognition. The problem with recognition and recognition politics, and the way in which recognition has brought into psychoanalysis, like Hegel theory.
I'm sorry, yeah, it's hard to hear.
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes, that's better.
Okay, sorry. I'll speak more loudly. Did you hear anything I said?
Maybe if you could reiterate a bit of it. Yeah. I think you were speaking about recognition and truth, or I really couldn't hear, actually.
Okay, I'll try to repeat it. So what I was trying to say is that one way to hear your question is say, but yes, okay, we can experiment, but at the end of the day, we're social beings. We need the recognition of others. And that, of course, makes us vulnerable, because the more unusual the experiment, the more innovative it may feel like to us, but how does it require the consistency of social truth? And that reminded me some of what.
I think we again lost you. The voice is coming from.
Maybe everybody else can mute themselves again and see if that helps.
That's a good idea. Okay, can you hear me now? Is it better? Perfect. Thank you, Shreya. Okay, third time is a charm. So your question, Ian, could be heard as, right, we could experiment, we could innovate, but eventually we have to meet the other, we have to meet the world. And then the world will either meet us back or not. Like, will we be recognized? How do you go from the density of psychic life to a social life, where the world also responds to your, to whatever psychic invention you have come up with? And this connects it for me with Heba's questions earlier about recognition. So let me put this aside for a moment. I'll say something else and then I'll connect it. Recognition theory has come to psychoanalysis mostly through Jessica Benjamin's work. And it comes through Hegel's work and the notion of the master-slave dialectic. And I mention this because it's important to remember that recognition has a power relation built into it, where power, the power of the person who gets to recognize, the person who is not yet recognized, is built into the concept of recognition. So is, as Heba and I were talking about earlier, the wish to be recognized, or the desperation we feel sometimes about not being recognized or not being seen as who we are, right? But I would say that rather than that while recognition can also kind of like oxygenate in some ways our translations and give them more social density, there are other things that happen through invention and experimentation, that when a world is met that is not receptive but becomes curious or even excited by you. And I'm thinking of how the way in which Jose Munoz talks about drag queens and kind of like the drag queens of color especially, and the ways in which kind of like they turn social rejection into a resource that gets turned into performance. And that performance is, people respond to those performances not through recognition, but through another kind of line that is of interest or sexual arousal. I mean, these, of course, have their own problems, just as recognition has its own problems. But what I'm trying to say is that recognition is not the only avenue through which we relate to invention. Excitement is, anxiety is. So how bringing the invention to the world will be met by the world opens up, it's not the binary of, and now will I be recognized or not, opens up a whole stage of negotiations that also have to do with how the other responds to your otherness. And to the otherness, when I speak about otherness, I don't just mean your otherness to the other or the otherness of the other to us. I'm thinking specifically about the opacity in ourselves, that we're always opaque to ourselves. even when we think we fully understand ourselves. And psychoanalysis teaches us that, right? That even people who have had to argue, and this perhaps goes also to Moon's point, who have had to argue, I'm trans, I've always been trans, there's nothing ambivalent about my transness, in the safety of a long-term treatment, will ask questions that do not contest that necessarily. I'm not talking about like taking that away, but questions that are not allowed elsewhere, because one would immediately pounce on them and say, see, you're not trans. And we all have them. The question is, where do we feel safe expressing them and exploring them, and with whom?
I think we'll take one last question by Emilio.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. Very exciting. I was thinking about when you were talking about taking sides with experimentation, you said that was not a technique, that you were not offering a technique. And I don't come from psychoanalysis. I come from performance and voice studies. But I'm interested in that relationship between technique and identity. And I've been always very drawn to the without in the book, the without identity part. So I'm thinking about, patient affirmation and slowness and humility as a kind of technique, maybe like a negative capability or something about tolerating the not knowing. And so basically my question is, how do you understand technique as discerning and intervening identity through interpretation? Like, is it that there is something about not only anti-essentializing or deontologizing, but also what we do then with technique? Is that?
Yeah. I think this is a really good question, because of course you're kind of like very kindly and gently calling me out, saying, like, you say there's no technique, but what about this? Like, you are actually saying, like, I am saying something, and you're right about that. You're not wrong about this, but it's not a technique in the sense that the question of what it means for an analyst to help defend somebody's efforts to make something work as truth, or for somebody's side to take sides with a patient's self-invention. The question of how one does that, there is no one way to do it, nor do I have outside the context of a particular case study, a way of thinking about how something like that should be done without the analyst injecting herself too much and making it about herself, or acting as if she understands what the patient's invention is. I think that's always the problem with invention and with recognition, that recognition is always selective. It's selective based on what you think you understand about yourself and the world. So recognition always picks and selects unknowingly and implicitly from what you see, the things that you feel could work or do work or make sense to you, or you've seen them work in another context. When in fact the invention it's like a mosaic, it has so many elements. If you step in too quickly to do the work of affirmation, this is my issue with affirmation, not in the sense that I'm antagonistic to affirmation, I'm not. But my problem is that when we respond to otherness just with affirmation, we close down the space for us to be surprised, or for us to respond to the other's gesture of invention, not with a yes or a no, but with allowing ourselves to be taken up and to see what happens in us. Like, for me, this is a very relational process, but not relational in the sense of subject to subject, but in the sense like the other's opacity to my opacity, like what I don't and can't know about myself, and what it might arouse in me to be in contact with the other person's difference. And this is what makes, I think, this way of thinking about things much less technical. It is very much a sensibility. I would call it a sensibility, not technique. But it is not insofar as I'm saying we should stop doing what we're doing, it is also a technical suggestion. So in that sense, you're right. But thinking as a performance scholar, does that resonate with what we're asking, or do you want to say something about that? Or
no, for sure. No, I love that, because at least my intuition is not that we have to do without technique, but that actually your invitation to review not only gender but identity is also an invitation to review technique, because those are somehow always connected.
I really like the way you put it, because they're both technologies of something.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.